Muy buenos días, señoras y señores, a todos los presentes. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a este encuentro académico donde tendremos la oportunidad de escuchar la conferencia magistral de una de las voces más reconocidas a nivel comparado en Derecho y en Teoría Constitucional. Nos acompaña hoy y tengo el honor de presentar al profesor Bruce Ackerman, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science de la Universidad de Yale, autor de numerosos trabajos que han tenido una gran influencia, un gran impacto, tanto en materias de filosofía política, derecho constitucional y políticas públicas. Entre ellos destaco la obra que aborda la historia constitucional de Estados Unidos en 3 volúmenes, With the People. También Social Justice in the Liberal State. Y más recientemente, Revolutionary Constitutions, Charismatic Leadership and the Rule of Law. El profesor Ackerman se encuentra en nuestro país invitado por el Consejo para la Transparencia, representado en esta instancia por el profesor David Ibaceta. Para comenzar, escucharemos el saludo del decano de la Facultad de Derecho, el profesor Pablo Ruiz-Tagle.
Muy buenos días. Me alegra mucho ver el interés que existe por estar presentes en esta reunión en la que vamos a poder escuchar al profesor Bruce Ackerman. En un libro homenaje que el profesor Bruce Ackerman escribió para honrar al colega y profesor Mirjan Damaska, señalaba que en 1972 tuvieron un encuentro, y cito comillas, él dice: yo tenía 29 años, él 41, pero ambos estábamos al comienzo de nuestras carreras académicas en Estados Unidos. Fui un tipo afortunado, apuntaba. Conozco a Bruce Ackerman y al profesor Mirjan Damaska desde 1987, cuando fui a estudiar a la Universidad de Yale. Y su carrera académica desde entonces es muy variada. No ha hecho más que ganar prestigio y reconocimiento, y sus puntos de vista son muy influyentes y muy controvertidos. Sigue creando, es un profesor, ustedes lo van a ver, lleno de energía. Y por eso puedo decir que soy también una persona muy afortunada al haber conocido a este profesor, haber sido su alumno, haber conocido a Guido Calabresi, a Guy Lamar, Michael Risman, el profesor Mirjan Damaska y muchos otros, Owen Fisk, con los cuales mantenemos una relación muy estrecha en la Facultad de Derecho y en otras facultades de Derecho también en Chile, con la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Yale. Él es autor de una veintena de libros, no quiero robar tiempo haciendo referencia a ellos, pensé traerlos, son muchos, la verdad es que son muy variados. Su primera época, digámoslo así, es una época dedicada al estudio de cuestiones de filosofía del derecho, jurisprudence. No es casualidad porque él fue alumno de John Rawls y de la gran profesora también Judith Clark en Harvard, y esos eran sus intereses primarios. Eso explica su obra Social Justice in the Liberal State, Reconstructing American Law, y quizás su estudio sobre propiedad y constitución. Más tarde, a partir del año 1991, y a mí me tocó ver, digamos, cómo desarrollaba sus ideas antes de publicarlas, comenzó su serie We the People con su tesis acerca de los momentos constitucionales, que ha sido muy influyente en muchos lugares del mundo y que también ha permitido reconstruir una visión de los procesos constituyentes, de los procesos constitucionales. Él ha preparado una conferencia especialmente referida a Chile. Tiene algunas propuestas que son novedosas, controvertidas, pero sobre todo le interesa exponer sus ideas por una media hora y luego tener una conversación abierta con comentarios, con preguntas. Una conversación que además va a continuar con profesores, con profesoras en la sala de facultad, en un ambiente académico inmediatamente después de esta conferencia. Acaba de publicar un libro hace 2 semanas sobre la posmodernidad. Él nos contaba ayer que los Sterling Law Professors, el Sterling Professor, no Sterling Law Professor, tienen el privilegio en la Universidad de Yale de enseñar cualquier materia. O sea, él podría mañana enseñar física, química, astronomía, si quisiera, y nadie podría negárselo. Ha estado al borde, digamos, de reclamar ese derecho porque ha escrito sobre temas muy, muy variados. Ha seguido de cerca el proceso constituyente chileno. No les voy a adelantar lo que él plantea. Su charla magistral de hoy es Procesos Constitucionales en Chile, y dice derechamente el título: a pesar de su fracaso, o aparente fracaso, hay mucho que aprender del esfuerzo de Chile por repudiar el legado constitucional de Pinochet. Estamos muy agradecidos del Consejo de la Transparencia. El profesor David Ibaceta representa al Consejo de la Transparencia en esta sala, que lo haya traído. Paula nos ha ayudado en la moderación, en la organización, y sobre todo agradecemos la generosidad y buena disposición del profesor Ackerman para impartir esta conferencia. Estamos seguros que su energía va a trasladarse a la cuestión constituyente chilena, que hay algunos han hablado de que está en un punto de fatiga. Yo diría que no es así, no hay fatiga cuando ha existido de parte de la población un compromiso tan grande, tan importante con la participación, sino que estamos en un intermedio, diría. Un momento de reflexión para el cual la venida y las ideas del profesor Ackerman son especialmente importantes y valiosas. Muchas gracias, démosle un aplauso y escuchemos al profesor.
Well, thank you very much. I should say that when I first came to Yale as a Sterling professor, I decided that every semester I would take a class somewhere in the university to learn something. And the first class I stumbled into by accident was taught by Juan Lintz. This fellow was a genius. I knew nothing about Latin America. Yo puedo hablar español, pero de España y Portugal. I knew about that, but I really didn't know anything about Latin America. And this fellow knew everything. You know, I mean, it was just incredible. He could tell you, you know, Section 742 of the Constitution of, sorry, of Haiti. Everybody knows about that. All the students. This was before the internet, so they just shuddered rather than looked at their iPad to find out about Section 742. Then he introduced me to Al Steppen. And these two people really led me to learn about Latin America. And they wrote this great book, which I'm actually still deeply influenced by, The Perils of Presidentialism. And how presidentialism in Latin America, they argued, and there are arguments on both sides, is the fundamental source of 132 military coup d'etat in Latin America. However different Pinochet might be from others, I want to, before we begin, emphasize that this interdisciplinary spirit is precisely the spirit of the Yale Law School. And moreover, we now have a very well-funded program of world fellows and other fellowships for young scholars and not so young scholars to come to Yale for a semester or a year in one or another, designation, depending upon your progress in the academy, and simply to think. You don't have to teach. You can take courses, whatever ones you want, in any department that you want, and encounter not only head doctor, professor, Dr. Bruce Ackerman, but the next generation. And the generation after that, I'm saying goodbye, hopefully in a stylish way. But, we have people who are really, really creative, who are 40 years old and 60 years old. And they're, they're dedicated to the proposition that Bruce Ackerman is wrong. And that they have the right path. And this spirit of independence and interdisciplinariness is a great asset when you come back to Chile or any other place, because it gives you a framework for understanding and comparing Latin American institutions, the status of the Organization of American States, for example, is something that is of fundamental importance. And as you all know, you are creating a regional federation without even noticing. And the court, etc. So I would very much let me know if you're interested. I will simply send it to the relevant officials. I'm not, this is not my life to be a bureaucrat. But there are very skilled and thoughtful people in charge of these programs, and I'll just send them your names onto them, and you can apply years in advance. It doesn't have to be like tomorrow. Okay, I begin this way because otherwise I'll talk too long and I won't say this, and this is really quite important to say to you. So I was, of course, one second here. Yes. I get invited to a lot of places and turn them down. Because both my wife and I, my wife is really a leading thinker on law and economics, political science, and especially corruption, and is a professor as well. We care for one another, and I prefer to stay at home and talk to her, and we write every day and then do things like go to plays in the evening, and that's fine. But the reason I said yes to the very kind offer of the Council of Transparency is because, of course, I have followed events in, thanks to Juan Linz, etc., in Chile and Brazil and other places for 40 years. First time I was here was 40 years ago. And of course, I I'm a knowledgeable outsider, and I can speak Spanish and all of that. But I wanted to find out what people were really thinking in this crucial moment of Chile's history. And so far, with very few exceptions, I find that everybody's depressed. I am not. I think that this Boric and this experiment is one of the few cases, maybe South Africa is another one, of hope in a world of crisis, obviously, and that you are mistaken in looking upon the last 50 years of since Pinochet. How many? 40-something years since Pinochet. It's a mistake to look upon Chile's experience as terrible or not so great. First, the first generation after Pinochet, using the Constitution of 1980, managed a peaceful transition from a military dictatorship to a democracy. Well, that's easier said than done. Just look at Colombia. Just look around Latin America. But you don't only have to restrict your gaze to Latin America. There are any number of transitions from a military dictatorship by mobilized democratic forces that fail. Yours did not. You succeeded. In a very complicated way, this experience is to be analogized to the Peace and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, which once again, we had a much more vicious military repression of the majority of Black people who were the majority of the population, and we had a peaceful transition through Nelson Mandela and others in which people were not thrown into jail. Even though the head of the last government became the vice president of Nelson Mandela's government. Incredible. This has happened in Chile, of course, and one of the invitations to you is to engage in disciplined comparisons of success stories. I'm much more interested in success stories than failure stories. I'm interested in why things fail, of course, but it's much more interesting to see whether we can learn something from the successes, even though the culture of Chile couldn't be more different from the culture of South Africa. You see. Nevertheless, is there similarities? All right, well, that's the kind of question that I want to ask. But Chile has now moved from this democratic transition by traditional elites who had complicated relationships to the Pinochet government. Some independent, some not so independent, some trying to be pragmatic. I'm not interested in detailing that. To a second phase in which a rising movement led by a representative of the rising generation, who is not even 40 years old, actually wins a democratic election and says we have to have a constitution that totally repudiates the Pinochet era in a way that the first generation did not, because they were engaged in a peaceful transformation. If they had repudiated, then they would have started criminal prosecutions against people who did terrible things. No question about it. This is remarkable. A spokesman who nobody heard of 5 years before. Who had heard of him? Maybe he could have qualified for a World Fellow position. Maybe not. Becomes the leader. Moreover, and this I want to emphasize, is something which is an example of an unintended constitutional provision for this purpose, but nonetheless is terribly important. Even though the constituent assemblies have failed to gain the endorsement, Boric cannot run again, right? He cannot run again. Who the next president of Chile is going to be is a very fundamental and interesting question. There's going to be a replacement of Boric, who will be trying to reorganize and consolidate this very diverse movement that Boric led. Who will he or she be? There's going to be competition here, right? And who will the quote-unquote conservatives be? A representative of the preceding democratic regime or a new person? I don't know, but you don't know either. But it's great that you don't know. You see, right now you're saying, oh, we failed. But this is a great election that's going to come before you, because of this provision that Boric cannot run again, right? A one-term limit. I myself don't know any other country that has a one-term limit. There are many countries that have two-term limits, like the United States and France, right? And of course, Boric could run again afterwards. But still, this opening, so contrast the election that you're going to confront with the election that the Americans are confronting now. You know, two old people saying the same old things that has been said in the last two elections. Nothing new. Of course, there are new crises, you know, Gaza, Ukraine, but they're the same tired people. This is not a new beginning, this election for America. Obviously, if Trump wins, it will be a disaster to democracy. But we already knew that in 2016, and he won. Then he lost. Then he won again, or that would be terrible. But if Biden wins, it'll be same old, same old. You see. But that's not true with you. You are actually looking to the future and asking, how should we govern ourselves? Great. Okay. So that is the first positive point that all you depressed people have failed to appreciate. But now I want to emphasize several other very important creative elements in the design of the Constituent Assembly, which I hope somehow, and I will try, but I think that you should try as well, in complicated ways, to keep in mind, both in your scholarship and when other countries of Latin America are engaged in constituent acts of constitution making. The first and unprecedented, so far as I know, which doesn't mean it's true, but I have looked at a lot of constitutional constructions. The first is this provision that anybody who is elected to the Constituent Assembly could not take a position in government for 4 years. Incredible, brilliant. What does that mean? In most, it means that the leading people in the existing government, it happens to be boards, but that any government, are typically the ones who are also in the Constituent Assembly. So they have this powerful incentive, which they may struggle against, but they have this powerful incentive to design the Constitution so as to keep their government in power. That's not good. The point of a constitution is to look 30 or 40 years into the future. Of course, we don't know what will happen, and try to organize the institutions for democracy that will survive and sustain themselves over this period. Not forever, but for the next generation or two. That would be a triumph, enough. Well, that's precisely what this provision of disqualification will do, because people who are senior people in government will not resign their governmental positions to run and maybe win for the Constituent Assembly. If they do that and they wait 4 years, someone will replace them in the government as a leader. They're going to stay. So who is going to run? And two sorts of people: senior statesmen who are, let's say, 70 years old and who have served in government, both as opposition and in the government, for decades, and have, if you will excuse the expression, wisdom. They know that they are going goodbye, and they're trying to take this opportunity to contribute to the next generation. Great. Forget whether they are left-wing, right-wing. This is independent of that. And second, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, who are up in commerce. Maybe they have gained a seat in the provincial legislature or something like that. For them to run and to get into the Constituent Assembly means that they can, if they are lucky, gain national attention for their good ideas or for their bad ideas. Well, if they get the national attention for their bad ideas, this is going to hurt them for the rest of their careers. But they're young, they can shift and do something else. But some of them will have actually good and interesting ideas that will appeal to the next generation of Chileans, who are, after all, the people who are going to live through this constitutional period if it's successful. So they have a special claim on this constitutional concern. So this is a brilliant idea. Never happened. No one's ever done this before. And that's something that should be affirmed. The second let me just make sure. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time, so let me go to, and then we have this notion expressed in different ways in the first and second constituent assemblies, that there should be a group of juristic experts. many of the elected leaders, young and old, are legally trained. Not all of them, but they are legally trained. But they're not to be confused with actual people who have devoted their lives to scholarship principally, not exclusively, but principally, and who actually are in a position to have read books. If in the United States, I think it's fair to say that when amazingly enough, at the present time of the 100 senators of the United States, the number of graduates of the Yale Law School is 16 out of 100. Ridiculous, but true. So they've heard, they maybe have read a book of mine. And lots of other people have heard of Bruce's. They haven't read it. They haven't read it. But people in the scholarly world have. And think I'm wrong, think I'm right, and have actually considered, well, what you have done is to have processes, I don't need to explore the details, in which they actually contribute to the conversation which informs the drafting of the Constitution. This doesn't happen. Happens occasionally. I can point to analogies, but this is a great idea. Once again, this is a success. Why did you fail? People have all sorts of complex reasons. I have a very simple answer, which requires none of the scholarly depth, et cetera, and so forth that I'm calling for. The big mistake was that when people went into the polling booth, they were asked to vote yes or no on one question. Should you approve the Constitution? Rather than have multiple questions, right? Which distinguish. Now, we've had, in the United States and other places, we've actually had a good deal of experience that I can be happy to talk about in the question and answer. We have many referenda in the United States, not on the national level, but on the state level. Let's say California, whose population is 37 million compared to Chile's 25 million. It's a real important unit. When voters walk into a plebiscite on some fundamental issues, they are asked 4 or 5 questions rather than one. In this case, the alternative would have been the alternative would have been one question on constitutional foundations. What are the constitutional foundations? Should there be a presidentialist form of government? Well, or a parliamentary? That's much too simple. The first proposal is a complex form of semi-presidentialism. And there are many other forms which we as scholars could actually usefully have. Should the head of the electoral court, or whatever we want to call it, be the same person as the head of the constitutional court? Well, the head, I say no. That's a big mistake. It's bad. Nonetheless, both in Brazil and in Chile, they actually discharged their functions in a principled fashion. But you could see the complexities here if you make the same person head of both of these. It's not necessary. But this is part of the constitutional foundations. Should there be one house or two houses? Should the indigenous people be represented or not in one or another way? All of this is the foundation. But then there are fundamental issues of principle that also these draftsmen are committed to. Should women have an absolute control over their bodies so far as abortion is concerned? Yes, said the first convention. No, said the second convention. Who should own copper? Private enterprise or public? Okay. Well, if my thought, and I'm giving this out so that I could hear your reactions, is if you had 3 or 4 propositions, and the campaign had been not 2 weeks, but several months, that was another mistake. But it's not a profound mistake. It was, why did this happen? I'm not quite clear. If you had 3 or 4 months, you could have targeted 4 issues. I've given you examples of these issues. My prediction on the first Constitutional Convention, their proposal the Constitutional Foundation's question would have passed 70-30. Who was against it? Answer, the native indigenous peoples were mobilizing against the failure to adequately have them represented in their own tribunal. That's not good enough to win a rejection. They, on the merits, they may well be right. I'm not interested in whether I agree or not. I'm interested in organizing the constituent process. Then we would have had a vote on abortion. Who would have won? Well, I don't know. The vote would have been 53-47. Or 55-45, which, that's what democracy is all about. If it had been rejected, well then, that doesn't end things because one of the key provisions of the constitutional foundations is the provision on constitutional amendment. Just because it lost in this referendum doesn't mean it's lost forever. Nothing is forever, but certainly. Similarly, if on the question, should the state or private enterprise own the copper, which is a source of the great economic promise of Chile, who would have won? Well, you could tell me. But once again, it would have been close. So what we would have had was a yes to the constitutional foundations, and a maybe on these 2 or 3 crucial issues. I'm not trying to say that they're not fundamental. Minimum income for the poor would be, but now I'm telling you my own social democratic beliefs, but that was also a potential issue to be brought forward. And this is a fundamental constitutional guarantee in some countries and not in others. So my basic thesis is that this was just a mistake. A sad mistake. And finally, how much more time do I have? Any more time? 5 minutes. Finally, from this vantage point, I think that I'm not saying that you should have a third constituent assembly. People are, demoralized about that. But I do believe that there is one issue which should be the subject of a constitutional revision debate. and especially during the remaining time of Boric and during the next presidential presidency and parliament, whoever wins. And that has to do with states of emergency. After all, one of maybe the key point which led Boric to invest so much of his time and energy on this constituent assembly, these constituent assemblies, after all, was his youth. You see, Nelson Mandela, by the time he was in Boric's position, was 65 years old. Here is this 39-year-old. Incredible, but nonetheless inexperienced. It wasn't obvious that he should have had a constituent assembly. He could have done other things with his majority. But he did this. Why? Because, and I'm with him on this, it is of fundamental importance for the Chilean people to repudiate a constitution which is foundational in 1980 and is a Pinochet constitution. And that's a fundamental question. Well, the way you can repudiate that is by repudiating the existing provisions of the state of emergency, which is, after all, the mechanism through which Pinochet gained his claims of legitimacy, and which is inscribed in the Pinochet Constitution, as even though it has been amended many times in all this kind of way. And my proposal is actually seriously taken up in part, but I don't think only in part, because I did come down and talk to the experts in the second constituent assembly, and I encourage them, but I don't really. They took the view, which I think is a very good view, and has many precedents elsewhere, that we should not have a state of emergency terminated on the basis of a juridical or some other determination that the emergency is over, which is more or less the tradition in Latin America. Rather, we should go by a month-by-month basis. So Article 23 proposes, of the second Constitution, proposes that if there is a state of emergency, the president can declare it unilaterally for 1 month. That makes sense. If there's a state of emergency, it may be that the parliament is not even in session. But after the end of 1 month, the parliament, the deputies, have to, by a majority, approve it. If they don't, the emergency ends. Then, after another period, they choose a very short period, but that's not, let's say, every 3 months, once again, the parliament has to, in one or another, when I say parliament, because of course there are two chambers, et cetera, all of this details are important, but not important for this purpose. The parliament has to approve it again, and again, and again. And if the parliament doesn't, the emergency ends. Now, building on this, have proposed something stronger, which I call the supermajoritarian escalator. So, by a simple majority, Parliament has to approve it the first time. Then, let's say 3 months later, it has 60%, 60%, have to approve it. Then, the next time, 70%. Then the next time, 80%, and then 80% every time thereafter. What does this mean? It means that the opposition parties have to agree with the president that there really is an emergency. So if they, of course, they have political incentives and interests to say, no, there's no emergency, you're just being a Pinochet. Right? So so the only times they will continue the emergency is, if you will excuse the expression, there really is one. Because if there really is an emergency, let's imagine that the military is running a rebellion or something like that, and there is an emergency. Well, then, the minority democratic parties will join with the government in saying, we have to sustain the state of emergency. Of course, simply for the Constitution and the court to recognize there is no longer a state of emergency, that's only the first step. What happens? You have to implement it. It's one thing for the constitutionally democratic government with the support of the minority parties to say there is an emergency. It's another thing for the source of the emergency to stop. However, this legitimacy is very important. There will be mobilization in the streets. Moreover, the military will be reluctant to engage in this adventure, knowing that they confront the prospect of a delegitimation, which is not to say, I'll be finished in a second, which is not to say that this proposal or any constitutional proposal eliminates the danger that Pinochet, some Pinochet of the left or the right in 20 years' time will not take over Chile. But it does minimize it. That's all we can expect in the real world. What I'm talking about and what you're talking about is constitutionalism for the 21st century in the real world, not a philosophical question of what in an ideal world, imagined by social justice in the liberal state, for example, or even more compellingly, John Rawls's theory of justice or Jürgen Habermas, would in principle be ideal. These ideals, of course, are important as you write a constitution for the real world, but it's the real world that we're concerned with, and it's that real world and its deep structure which my newest book, The Postmodern Predicament, is all about. But thank you very much for listening.
Muchas gracias, profesor Bruce Ackerman. Vamos a tomar preguntas del público después de esta conferencia. ¿Quién tiene el... ¿Paula? Por ahí hay una. Rocío, sí. Y allá también. Rocío.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your... It's closer? There. Thank you for your presentation and your effort for cheering us up. I'm not sure you managed to succeed, but we'll see. So I have a question. I wasn't sure what your proposal was. So I agree with you that sort of a piecemeal referendum would have been nice to have instead of just voting yes or no to the whole document. However, since one of the goals of the process, at least the first process, was to repudiate Pinochet's constitution, as you said, I'm not sure how you can do that by just voting on some aspects of the Constitution. So if I understood your presentation, your idea would be that, well, let's focus on state of emergency, since this seems to be a symbolic and so relevant part of, you know, the authoritarian remains in our Constitution. But the problem I see, and I don't know what's your opinion on this, is that I don't know there's agreement on the fact that this is the most or one central aspect of what we would need to repudiate in order to have this kind of political meaning. You know, some people say, no, the main thing is social rights, or others say, no, the political economic order would be the real Pinochet inheritance. So my question is like, well, how do we deal with this? You know, like, who will decide what's the kind of central aspect we need to repudiate? Thank you.
Gracias. Por favor, les pido que se presenten antes de la pregunta.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. My name is Cristóbal Vallejos, and
Where are you? Over there.
I'm here.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Cristóbal Vallejos. I wanted to ask, it's not common for a constitutional project to be rejected by the people. It's not normal in the world. So especially if it is drafted by an assembly. So I wanted to ask if you know any other case in the world that can be observed by Chile in order to see how a country continues after not being able to solve its constitutional crisis.
Hello, my name is Gaspar. I'm a first-year student here. Amongst the main disputes around the nature, the functioning of the constitutional processes in the last few years was this, let's say, balance between a sort of mass democratic representation and manageability of the constitutional process, as in the possibility of making arrangements and agreements and such within the elected organisms. What I'm trying to get to, what I'd like to ask is if you see there's if you think there's an ideal way to balance those two necessities for a legitimate process out to make sure that one doesn't impede the other. Thank you.
Sure. No. I'll answer. So I think that I will begin with number 2. Are there cases in which constitutions have been rejected? Answer, yes. France. The French, here is Charles de Gaulle, the victorious general, who is the voice of France on the BBC, condemning the Vichy government, entering Paris in triumph. And the Constitution is proposed, and it's a parliamentary constitution. He wants to have it to be a super presidential constitution. He runs and he wins. It's rejected. Then he demands a presidential constitution with you know who as the president, but you know it, l'état c'est moi. And the second time, the other Free French forces, because of course there was a great internal Free French mobilization of socialists, communists, and Republicans who they are all mobilized, say, no, we're perfectly happy to have de Gaulle as a quasi-presidential system, but not the kind that he wants, and they do it again. And de Gaulle runs again, and he loses, right? So we have a repudiation followed by a success. And what does de Gaulle do? He tries to have a political party, and then he loses again in a couple of crucial elections, and he goes to into self-imposed exile. Right. If you read the newspapers of the 1950s, you find that he is treated just like Winston Churchill has been. You know, a great token of the past, but not of the future. And then what happens is the Fifth Republic. And the dynamic processes of the Fifth Republic, all of this, I talk about at a very substantial length in this book, Comparative on Revolutionary Constitutions. So here is a fascinating case of rejection and final vindication 15 years later. To put it in the Chilean case, what Boric has managed to do is to put this on the status of the Pinochet Constitution in the collective memory of the Chilean people for the next generation. We don't know what the future is going to be, but if someone who is a more astute version of Boric, 55 years old, and is a much more, says, aha, now is the time, it isn't a completely unfamiliar idea. It's already been there. So that is, it seems to me, an important contribution, especially if you reflect on the other features. Now, the first question is how to do it. Excellent. Of course, you're right. The members of the Constituent Assembly are going to have to specify in a document which provisions of the text are to be understood as part of the constitutional foundation. Which provisions of the text are to be understood as economic justice? Which provisions of the text are to be considered having to do with the rights of women over their bodies or something like that? And they have to specify that. And there will be good faith disagreements, but they have to be resolved in order for the referendum to take place. Right? Now, so these elaborate texts, who will read them? Almost nobody. That is to say, lawyers will read them. In a percentage of the voting population who are lawyers and who are friends of lawyers who will take the trouble to explain them is, 5%, maybe. But if you had 4 months, the proponents and the opponents will go on the media. And of course, that's a very important dimension of things. And there will be debates over it. And so, relatively speaking, this will be an informed vote. Not going to the last question, the ideal way. This is not what I'm talking about. There is no ideal way of organizing the convention. The most important feature of the Chilean proposal was the disqualification of members of the government for 4 years. This was a brilliant move to go toward the ideal of thoughtful, serious consideration of the problems Chile is going to be confronting over the next 40 years. And it should be emphasized that Chile and much of Latin America, with the exception of Mexico, is going to be much more independent of the United States domination than it was in the 20th century. Because the Americans are the dominant power, but they have more important priorities in Asia, with the rise of India and China, and Western Europe and Europe with the Russian problem. And so you can gain a good deal of independence because we can't afford anymore to intervene and say, kill the president of Chile and replace him, please. And have the CIA go in there because we can't follow up with the military. Except in Mexico. There we have a real problem. No, I'm trying to be realistic. We have a real problem. One of Trump's great issues is don't let all these Mexicans come into the United States. Well, I myself am bitterly opposed to this, but this is a different issue of right next door. And after all, the United States did not only, in 1963, begin the intervention in Brazil, where, once again, there's simply a military coup sponsored by the United States. Got very complicated. In the case of Mexico, we took half of Mexico. The Americans took half of Mexico in the 1840s and 50s. We just took it. And this is the Monroe Doctrine really applied in an imperial fashion. But we're not going to do that with Chile. Brazil. Okay.
Gracias.
I answered all three questions, yeah.
Right. ¿Alguien más?
¿Tienen el micrófono? Good evening, Professor Ackerman.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. My name is Daniel Garcia.
I don't see you yet.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
My question for you is, why is it that we have to look to create a constitution for the next 40 years when the US has thrived on a constitution more than 200 years old? Shouldn't we aspire to create a constitution that can last that long?
Now, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure that I understood.
¿Cuál es la pregunta, perdón?
Sí. Just speak slowly. That's
okay, sorry. Why is it that we have to look to create a constitution for the next 40 years when the US has thrived on a constitution more than 200 years old?
Okay.
Shouldn't we aspire to create a constitution that can last that long?
Good evening, Mr. Professor Ackerman. So I don't want to make a shallow question, so excuse me if I do. But in regards to your constitutional thesis, you say that we should ask more than one question, and that asking one question was our mistake. So I wanted to know, how do we know what are the right questions to ask, and what are the questions that are relevant to the people we're asking? And who's going to determine those questions? And how the group that is going to be, I don't know, that is going to have problems with the decision, how do we make sure they don't blame that we may be asking the wrong questions? Thank you.
Buenos días. Yo quería consultar respecto a su opinión sobre el voto.
Despacio.
Despacio.
Su opinión respecto al voto obligatorio en este proceso.
Mandatory voting or voluntary?
Okay. Yes, three questions. How do we know? The answer is that you have the Chilean people have elected 125 representatives whose job it is to put together a constitution. It's for them to decide what the important questions are and then answer them by drafting the Constitution. Bruce Ackerman says the important question is the state of emergency. They say, forget about it. I'm not elected by the Chilean people. It's the 120 people who are, with the help of the experts, but it's these 120 people. So it's they who have struggled for several months to put together something that they believe, as democratically elected representatives, with the disqualification of 4 years, which is a brilliant suggestion, to present to the Brazilian people. Then it's up to them to decide how to define the issues in a way that will make things seem plausible. And then we have 4 months of Democratic critics saying, it seems plausible, but it's wrong. So that is the answer. Now we go to the 200-year-old American Constitution. And here, alas, I have to go back to my theory of We the People, the 3 volumes. The Constitution of the United States has been fundamentally revised, and many of its basic premises have been repudiated over the course of the last 200 years. The piece of paper called the American Constitution has virtually no relation to the constitutional principles of the American Republic, except in one fundamental respect. The fundamental respect is this: the president is elected for 4-year terms. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. The Senate is elected every 6 years. I mean, a Senate term is 6 years. So that means, that keep the court out of it for the moment. So that means that we have a characteristic and distinctive cycle of political dynamics, which is different from the Chilean cycle of one term of the president, but at the same time, the assembly is voted. And then again, what is that cycle? In the first, at the end of the second term of office, the president has to leave. This is the great opportunity for the opposition. If they mobilize and say, we're going down the wrong path, then they will win, and they will also win in Congress, characteristically. So there will be 2 years in which all 3 democratic branches, House, Senate, and President, are governed by the same political party. They have a race against time. They have to pass things then, because characteristically, at the end of 2 years, the president is not running, and the president's party loses seats. Sometimes because the president has won very well in the first election, they still keep control of the House and Senate. But very often, they lose control of one or another branch. Then the president confronts an impasse, a difficulty, right? There are new problems that we have to deal with, but it's in the interests of the opposing party not to pass legislation. What happens? Unilateral presidential action increasingly has become legitimate. This is the theme that I develop at terrible length. It's a very short book published by, I forget which one, I think it's the Harvard Press, in 2013, which is called The Decline and Fall of the American Republic. And if you have to read a book of mine, forget about We the People, read that one. This sells many copies today because it's the first time someone said, look, we are in a different situation of presidential unilateralism. How to control that, right? And notice that, so take the war, right? Trump engages in presidential war making unilaterally. The text of the Constitution says, Congress shall have the power to declare war. Couldn't be clearer. Bye-bye. Who begins this? The person who begins this is the Clinton administration, which unilaterally engages in Kosovo. Then, after 9/11, the Bush administration unilaterally engages in several wars. Forget about, I was opposed to the wars on the merits. That's irrelevant for this purpose. Then Obama he runs on, I'm going to stop these wars. That's why he's elected. He repudiates his campaign pledge and continues the wars. Then Trump continues the wars, but then gets out of some of them. He continues the war against Iran, particularly. And Biden is continuing the wars. So what we have here is constitutional law developed by precedents, not the text. And when I cite this text, they say, oh, that's very interesting, Professor Ackerman. We value your input, which means, thank you very much, we're going to ignore you. When I actually have an idea that they take seriously, or these people in Washington take seriously, they say, hey, that's a good idea. But 75% of the time, they value my input. So the answer on this and many other questions is, how did this happen? And my basic response is, of course, everybody recognizes that fundamental changes happened in Reconstruction. I want to claim that the next great constitutional moment is the New Deal and the repudiation of laissez-faire as a principle of American government, and the legitimation of the activist, regulatory, social democratic state. And what we're seeing right now is a constitutional moment. We'll see how, in which Trump is repudiating that. And this is analytically different from Trump becoming a dictator. Okay, time to close this conference. Did I answer? Mandatory voting. I think that it's a great thing for Chile and Australia and New Zealand to engage in mandatory voting. Only don't take it too seriously, please. If you don't vote, what happens to you? They're going to throw you in jail? No. They're going to fine you maybe. It's a question of principle that citizens have a responsibility to be citizens. And the paradigmatic act of citizenship is to take the trouble to go to the polls and vote. And one of the great things about these most recent plebiscites is that the high turnout. This was really great because there have been many cases of constitutional proposed referenda which fail because they don't reach the floor. 40% floor, for example, in Poland. They failed it, and the constitution of the early revolutionary period failed because it won, but it didn't meet people were so demoralized. But this is not true in Chile yet. And it's up to you to decide whether it will be true in the future. Thanks.
Bueno, con esta...
And let me just say one thing. And as I said, feel free to email me, especially so far as the World Fellows are concerned. But if you're interested in following up on one or another issue that I've raised, I will either send something to you or send you. There are a lot of other people on the Yale faculty who might be more relevant depending on your interests. So I'd be more than happy to spend 2 minutes saying, talk to Scott Shapiro or something like that.
Muchas gracias, profesor Ackerman. Y con esta nota optimista, los invitamos a los profesores y a las profesoras a continuar la conversación en la sala de facultad, donde también vamos a tener un pequeño refrigerio para poder compartir con el profesor Bruce Ackerman. Gracias.